For me, the biggest macro investment theme of 2025 is world peace.
David, thank you very much for joining us today. How are things in Israel?
Fantastic. Actually, not so fantastic because the deal that we got last week was a rotten deal. Even though we got 3 hostages back, we had to basically trade 2,000 hostages. I mean, whatever, mass murderers, actually terrorists, to get our people back. And it's just been very depressing to watch. But then again, hopefully there's method to the madness, which we can get into if you're interested later.
Well, I was going to ask you if there was a sense of optimism with this ceasefire, but it sounds like you're not too optimistic.
I think, listen, I mean, everybody in Israel, let's be honest. I mean, people obviously, I mean, I'm sure the families of the 3 hostages, the 3 women who were returned, they were very happy. I think the rest of the country was pretty depressed, I think, for the most part, because I think people don't understand what happened. Because again, apparently Israel came under enormous pressure from the U.S. to do this deal ahead of Trump's inauguration. And as you probably know, I mean, we're talking about exchanging whatever, 90 people, hostages, who are probably, a lot of them are dead, for literally 2,000 mass murders. And I think, but in the event, I think, hopefully there is more to the story. I think the bigger story is that I think, this makes me think that, there's probably a deal between Israel and Trump about, basically taking on Iran fairly soon. I mean, let's put it this way. The only way I can justify Israel agreeing to such a rotten deal is that there is a certain understanding with Trump that once this is done, that, U.S. will basically essentially support Israel all the way as it takes out Iran's nuclear basically program, which is obviously at a breakout point.
Okay, and I was going to ask you about that, so I'm glad you brought it up because I spoke to somebody else recently, and he thinks it's inevitable that Israel and the U.S. will attack Iran. What's your thoughts on that?
I think either Israel or the U.S. will attack Iran fairly soon. I don't think it's going to be the U.S. because I think Trump basically, campaigned on the promise of peace. So I think the last thing he's going to do is, basically, order an attack on Iran in his first days in office. So I think from that point of view, this is why Trump has been so eager for Israel to reach a ceasefire in agreement with Hamas in Gaza, so as to be able to push Israel and Saudi Arabia, to normalize their relations in order to build an anti-Iran alliance. That's the sort of the sequencing you have to understand, the sort of the thinking behind the Trump team. Ceasefire in Gaza, Israel, Iran, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Saudi basically normalization, and then go hit Iran. But I think actually at this point, based on what Trump said, basically on the day of the inauguration, it doesn't feel like a deal with Saudi Arabia is that close, which leads me to think that, probably Israel will have to go ahead and hit Iran, even without a deal with the Saudis.
Okay, so that's what you think is going to happen in the Middle East. Why don't we move on now and talk about Ukraine? Trump said he would end the war in Ukraine. Do you think this is possible?
I think, let's put it this way. I think, it's very clear that, I've always said, let's start with the sort of bigger picture. What is the big picture here? And this is something I've been talking about a lot. And I think I've talked about it on your show and other people's show on CNBC and so on and so forth, which is that I think, for me, the biggest macro investment theme of 2025 is world peace. Okay. Now, what does it mean, world peace? It was interesting because Trump said in his inauguration speech that he wanted to be remembered as a peacemaker. Let me tell you, actually, this was the first time that a U.S. president gave so much emphasis, to world peace in his inauguration speech. In fact, not since 1913, on the eve of World War I, Woodrow Wilson made a similar remark in his speech, by the way. It's interesting, okay? So I think, and this is consistent with my view in general, that I think Trump really meant it when he said that he wants to basically end the conflicts. That after all, this is the man under whom, basically, this is the man who was the first U.S. president since Jimmy Carter, who did not send U.S. troops into new foreign conflicts. So from that point of view, I think Trump has got a pretty decent track record when it comes to his bragging right. Now, whether he's going to be successful or not is a different story, but there's no doubt that is the intention. And now, by the way, I'm not telling you that Trump is some kind of hippie peacenik. He's not that, okay? What he is, however, is a realist. Now, it's interesting I brought up basically Woodrow Wilson, in case you don't know, many of your viewers probably don't, that basically Woodrow Wilson was really the beginning of American idealism in foreign policy, okay? I would argue the succession of American presidents for the most part in the last 100 years have all been idealists to a great extent. And what we mean by idealist is that they put human rights, liberty, and democracy above everything else. When you compare, for example, Anthony Blinken's basically Senate testimony, 4 years ago versus what Marco Rubio said last week, Anthony Blinken spoke extensively about one of the key goals of U.S. foreign policy under Biden was going to be to promote democracy abroad. Okay. Guess what? Marco Rubio barely mentioned the word democracy, okay, in his testimony. Just like Trump, even Marco Rubio sees China as a dangerous rival, okay? They've never cast or framed the rivalry in ideological terms, okay? And this is the most important thing. The reason why I'm confident, or rather I'm optimistic, that Trump is going to bring world peace back is because he's not ideological. He doesn't see the world through the lens of, basically democracy versus authoritarianism, good versus evil. He doesn't see it that way. What he does see, however, is a lot of opportunities for doing deals. Now, when we're talking about doing deals, by the way, I think this is the most important thing, which is that under Biden, Biden's people saw the world as one big zero-sum game. That if China wins, then we lose. If Russia wins, we lose. If we win, China loses. So that was it. So, if you see the whole world as basically one giant zero-sum game, then, the only objective you have is to win all the time. Now, Trump doesn't look at it that way. He looks at the world as basically lots of opportunities for win-win outcomes. Now, this does not mean that there is a win-win outcome for everything, okay? In terms of U.S. China relations or U.S. Russia relations, so on and so forth. But Trump is willing to look for basically opportunities that exist. And there are plenty, by the way. Again, Trump is not some basically hippie peacenik, nor is he someone who believes in doing deals just for the sake of doing deals. We're talking about doing deals that will serve the best interest of America. But at the same time, Trump understands to get a deal, it has to be a good enough deal for both sides. Otherwise, and Trump ultimately understands a deal is better than no deal. Okay. And there was no negotiation between Biden and Xi Jinping. There was no negotiation between Biden and Putin. They were not even talking. If you're not even talking, what can you negotiate? Nothing. Okay. Trump wants to basically meet with Xi Jinping. He wants to basically meet with Putin, so on and so forth. That's the beginning of something. And the most important thing is that other than the fact that Trump is not ideological, he has no problem getting his hands dirty. In the business of doing deals, you almost have to get your hands dirty. I don't know what you can get done. Like, unless you, of course, you're Trudeau, of course, then you drive your country into a total, basically, toilet. Okay, if you don't want to get your hands dirty. We have a great example in Canada, of course. But Trump is the opposite of basically Trudeau. Obviously, if you think about everything Trudeau stands for, basically, Trump is exactly the opposite. But the point here is that I think in that respect, I think, what we need to understand is that Trump, it does not mean that a deal that, like TikTok is a good example. 4 years ago, Trump wanted to shut down TikTok. Now he wants to basically save TikTok. Because guess what? Things change. And when things change, you have to be prepared to change. So from that point of view, that's about flexibility. It's about playing chess as opposed to playing checkers. Okay? So there is there's nothing about Trump that I can tell you right now, this is exactly what it's going to do, because to a great extent, it depends on the circumstances. And as circumstances change, he will change. But one thing I do know is that we should give him the benefit of doubt to the extent that he is going to bring back this mentality that let's do a deal when there is one on the table. And that's the most important thing. Now, you asked me about Ukraine and Russia. Well, let's think about this. Actually, this is one area I think it's very clear that Trump, right now, even Trump is realizing that it may be a little bit more difficult than he thought. Because at the end of the day, even when you want to do a deal, there's a time for everything. Even in business, you want to basically do a deal when everything basically says a deal is ready to be cooked, right? I can tell you that it's very clear, from what Trump has said over the last 3-4 days, that the Russia deal is not yet cooked, okay? To the extent that I think when Trump revised his timeline from 24 hours to 6 months, with respect to how long it's going to take to end the Ukraine war, I think it's very clear that whatever approach or informal discussion between the Trump team and Putin over the past 6 weeks has not gone as well as hoped. Now, and I think it's completely understandable, by the way, completely understandable. And this is because, first of all, the Russians are gaining momentum in the battlefield. I mean, in fact, there's no doubt they've got the upper hand. I mean, in fact, and right now we're actually in the middle of winter. I mean, I don't have to tell you, in eastern Ukraine, you're talking about minus 20 basically degrees, like snowing. Like this is when, even the best, armies in the world are struggle to basically move, basically quickly, advance quickly when they're stuck in snow and ice and all that kind of stuff. And yet the Russians are moving. It's pretty amazing. Now, what is interesting, so I think from that point of view, Russia's winning this war right now. This is why Putin is not in a hurry to basically stop the war. Now, at the same time, and this is the most important thing, it's very clear that a core part of the proposal that the Trump team presented to Putin has been completely rejected by the Russians, which is the proposal to basically create a buffer zone between Ukraine and Russia that will be patrolled by the British and French troops. Now think about this. If you were Putin for a moment, again, you don't have to like Putin to be able to put yourself in his head for a moment, just for a moment. As far as he's concerned, if you're going to have British and French troops on your border, okay, what would be the difference between that in practice and Ukraine actually becoming a NATO member? No difference. Okay, so if Russia fought this war in order to avoid having NATO directly on its doorstep, you think that they're going to say, okay, fine, let's bring in the French and the British troops? I mean, come on. So I think from that point of view, it was a little naive, but now on the part of the Trump thing, maybe not naive, but maybe that was exploratory. They want to see how far they can get with Trump. That was basically the first gambit, right? What we need to understand is this, following the Russian news over the past basically couple of weeks, it is very clear the Russian reaction to Trump's overture of peace is that there is a lot of mistrust about NATO, about America, and so on and so forth, which you could argue, again, if you're a Russian, it all makes a great deal of sense, which is from the Russian standpoint, in the last 20 years, they were lied to by the Americans, by NATO. In fact, just in 2022, Angela Merkel, the former chancellor of Germany, admitted that France and Germany signed the Minsk Accord with Russia back in 2014, only to buy time for Ukraine to build up its armed forces and build military strength. They never thought that this was a deal that they were going to stick to. So if you are Russians, with all that said, you don't know, Trump could very well, live through, his presidency, but what happens after Trump? A lot of Russians have died in this war. They want to make sure that there is a long-term, basically, security arrangement that they can sell to their people. After all, probably 100,000 Russians died in this war already. So I think from that point of view, all this basically means that Trump needs a bit of, I don't think, what this basically means is that the outcome of this war is going to be decided in the battlefield as opposed to by diplomacy. And what this most likely means is that Trump is going to let it play out because he has no choice. And this is probably another reason, by the way, Trump needs to save TikTok. Because the only person in the entire world who's got some leverage over Putin is, of course, Xi Jinping. For months, I was debating, with myself, like, so is Trump going to meet with Xi Jinping first or Putin first? It is very clear now, after what's happened over the last couple of weeks, Trump is probably going to meet with Xi Jinping first.
I hope you're enjoying this conversation with David Wu. Well, here we are in a new year with a new government, new policies, and a whole lot of uncertainty. And if you need help navigating this uncertainty and preparing for your financial future, consider having a discussion with a professional financial advisor. You can find out more information at wealthion.com/free. Once again, that's wealthion.com/free. Now let's get back to the conversation with David. Interesting points. One thing I want to touch on, you're not suggesting that politicians lie, are you?
Listen, politicians do what they have to do.
I'm being facetious. Of course they lie.
Listen, some are liars. There's no doubt. I think Biden is a liar. The fact that he preemptively pardoned 5 family members in the middle of Trump's inauguration speech, that has to say a lot about that man being a liar, because he had promised not to even pardon his own son, let alone 5 basically family members who haven't even been charged, just preemptively. And then the way he went about doing it was so basically underhanded that obviously everybody knows this did. So I think from that point of view, politicians will lie if they can get away with it, okay? And then there are politicians that lie or whatever, engage in tough talk simply because it's a tactic. Now, I think in the case of Trump, I don't think Trump can lie very much without getting himself into serious trouble. Because I think right now he's a bit of in the honeymoon. Right now his approval rating is 60%, even higher than at the start of the Biden presidency. But I think, when he's talking about this and that every day, wow, we're going to hit Canada, and then the next day, oh, we're going to hit China, all that. I think we have to basically realize a lot of it is about basically, again, playing chess. And it's not just about playing chess vis-a-vis China or Canada or Mexico or Europe for that matter. It's also about playing chess with basically, some of his greatest enemies within the U.S. Okay. For example, the military industrial complex does not want to see these wars to end. As far as the military industrial complex, they want to see these wars go on forever, because the Ukraine war has been a gravy train for basically the defense industry in the U.S. Okay. And then now you've got Republican Senate Services Committee last week unveiling a new proposal that would increase defense spending by 50%. Just think about that. So from that point of view, Trump has to stay on the chessboard. Let's put it this way. At this point, for Trump to get anything done, he needs to basically play off a lot of players against each other. And what I'm telling you is that's why he says a lot of things, because if he doesn't deal with China right away, basically there will be many Americans who are going to accuse him of being soft on China. If he doesn't deal with Russia, they're going to say, well, you're Putin's spy, and so on and so forth. He cannot afford that. So he needs to look tough. This is why he's declaring Canada as the 51st state, because what better way than that to basically build your credential as a tough guy. Okay. So I think, you got to see everything. Believe me, there's method to the madness. And I think, again, this is what makes Trump extremely predictable for me anyway. I'm a professor here in Israel. I teach game theory, and game theory is a very big part of what I do in terms of the way I analyze the people who make decisions. And great thing about game theory is that you don't have Mother Teresa and you don't have Adolf Hitler. You just have good players and bad players. Trump is definitely one of the best players in this game. Okay. And which in my view, being a good player just basically means that he is actually very predictable. If you actually look at the tactics he uses, it all comes straight out of the textbook.
So just to summarize a few of the points that you made about Ukraine, you think we will see peace in the Ukraine, but it's not going to happen today or tomorrow. It might be 6 months. It might be 12 months out.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's probably like, again, I think, literally you will have to see like the Russian army, at the gates of Kiev. Okay. I think that's when like things start to change. Now, of course, what that basically means is that things might actually get worse before they get better. Right. I mean, from the point of view that, like NATO last week already declared that, what this is declared by the General Secretary of NATO, was the former Dutch Prime Minister, who said, wow, listen, we got to be ready to basically to go to war with Russia. Right. You're going to hear a lot of talk like that. And then there might even be some actions around that. And Trump may be under a lot of pressure, to basically to go along with it, whatever it is. So I do think that on the Russia front right now, because right now the war in the battlefield is so one-sided right now, to the extent that the Ukrainians are literally broken, and the Russians, therefore, makes no sense for them to give in or give up right now, this advantage that they have. This is why they want to see this thing through. And I think that's why the next 6 months could be actually quite, basically dangerous. And by the way, I wanted to say this, like, because I actually was a bit more optimistic maybe a couple of months ago, like thinking that maybe like something else will happen. Okay, we'll find out. I'm not saying that, that I've turned pessimistic. Right now, the question is just a question of timing. Can the Chinese, for example, just think about this. What does Trump need from China? For the same thing that Ukraine wants, Ukraine is demanding security guarantee from the U.S. This is the only way Ukraine is going to accept a deal. What do you think Russia will want? Russia also wants a security guarantee, except the U.S. cannot give Russia a security guarantee. Who else can? China. This is why actually it's almost, I think, inevitable that U.S. and China will probably be the co-sponsors, actually, of this negotiation whenever it starts. But I think until it starts, I suspect that it's still too early to basically go along European assets. Because I think there's no doubt Europe looks very, very oversold. Europe is just like very much unloved in the market. But right now, I worry that the longer this war drags on, I think the worse the situation will be in Europe, because the Europeans are talking themselves into a war with Russia directly. And I think from that point of view, like, this sort of like has a direct, in terms of the timing of a deal on Ukraine, has a direct impact on the timing of when you're supposed to go along European, basically, stocks, for the euro for that matter. But I think you still have plenty of time. And then, of course, certainly not before the German elections next month anyway, which I see as the biggest story, by the way. The biggest political event of 2025, as every bit as big as the U.S. election 2024, will be the German election next month.
Okay, so let's have a conversation on Germany. Why do you say that?
Because I think, let's look at the world right now, right? I mean, let's look at the democracies of the world, right? I mean, because, if you think about this, polarization has been a big, big macro theme for the last 3 or 4 years. But polarization actually had two sort of like, aspects, okay? One is the international aspect, which is about basically the rivalry between the multipolar and the unipolar world led by the US, okay? The other aspect of polarization is political polarizations at a national level, right? And I'm to tell you that we've seen basically political consensus is broken, and we see people basically moving to these sort of extreme spectrums of basically conservative versus progressive politics. I mean, this has been a story that is very, very, basically common across, most democracies. I mean, including Korea right now, or Taiwan for that matter, or lots of other countries in Canada, which we don't want to talk about. But we'll talk about a little bit later. I've got a strong view about Canada. But the point here is, if we look within Europe itself, I would argue there are two camps. There are two types of countries. Those that are actually doing quite well despite polarization, and those that are absolutely doing dismally because of polarization. Now, in the camp that's doing fairly well, I would argue the number one is Italy. Italy has been the best performing major economy in Europe in the last 2 years, believe it or not. And the reason is because Italy has enjoyed a political stability that has been the envy of its neighbors. In fact, actually, I have not seen such basically high degree of political stability in Italy in the last 20 years of my career, by the way. And the reason of this political stability, despite extreme polarization in Italy, is because under Berlusconi, he promoted this idea of a right-wing alliance. Okay, so that was a very familiar idea to Italians. As a result, when basically, center-right basically parties decided to, consider going to a coalition with, the Brothers of Italy, which had been branded as, extreme right-wing, whatever it is, there was no real stigma or taboo associated with that. Okay. As a result, the right wing, has managed to basically put in fairly, market-friendly policies, and this is why the economy is doing very well. Okay, in Italy, because despite polarization. Another country that's doing very well despite polarization is, of course, Sweden, right? Sweden, the Swedish Democrats, okay, they are the so-called extreme right-wing basically party in Sweden. They got almost 30% of the votes in the last election. But they had a tacit understanding with the center-right parties in Sweden that they agreed not to enter the coalition government, but they would support the center-right minority government from the sideline, which this is what they've done. So they had a deal. So from that point of view, the center-right in Sweden understood that it would be ungovernable without the support of the Swedish Democrats. So they decided, instead of basically bringing them into the government, they'll just basically cultivate good partnership with them. They consult with them on major policy changes. In exchange, the Swedish Democrats are happy to basically keep the government going. And this has been a very, very successful story from the point of view of political stability. That's why Sweden is doing pretty well too. At the other end of the extreme, of course, you got France. Because Macron, that idiot, refuses to have anything to do with, the so-called extreme right or extreme left for that matter. As a result, right now, France does not have a governable majority. This is why France, okay, at this point, has already basically gone down the path of no return. At least not until Macron basically steps down, okay, which won't be for another 2 more years, because his term is going to expire. But maybe by then it's going to be too late for France. But the point here is that France has been the most visible casualty of polarization. The only question we should be asking ourselves right now is Germany going to become the next Italy or Sweden, or Germany set to become the next France? That is the only question I'm interested, okay, over the next month, because that will literally determine the outlook for Europe, because Germany is Europe at the end of the day. Now, why next month? Because next month we have the German federal elections. If you remember, the German government collapsed basically 3 months ago, and they decided to call an early election. So what is at stake in this election? I mean, as you know, and I've been arguing this for the last 3 years, which is that, Germany has been the sort of sacrificial lamb as the U.S. embark on this proxy war against Russia, right? Because the biggest loser of the Ukraine war has been Germany, because literally it broke up the partnership, the energy partnership that Germany had with Russia, that Germany spent decades cultivating and developing, right? Because Germany always understood that they were never going to be able to compete with the U.S. They were never going to, because the U.S. basically it's got energy, it's got money and everything, and they were never going to be able to compete with China because China's got basically cheap labor. So Germany thought the only way they could stay competitive is by, basically being able to access cheap energy from Russia. And the U.S. had no basically qualm to basically break that up, break up the party. And so now as a result, Germany has gone from basically a manufacturing recession in the last 3 years to now a manufacturing depression. I mean, literally, not a day passes without another German company announcing that they are leaving Germany for good. They're relocating their factory somewhere else, okay? Whether it's to China, the US, whatever, okay? So in my humble opinion, the biggest, I don't want to blame it all on the US, but I would blame it big time on the Green Party in Germany. The Green Party was the second largest party, okay, in this government that just basically been dissolved. And they had disproportional power. I mean, they only won 15% of the votes, but they were calling all the shots. They took the foreign ministry, the economy ministry. They literally dictated German policies over the last 3 years. And everything they did, everything they promoted, literally drove Germany into the ground. So in my view, what is at stake in the election next month is whether Germany is going to be able to unshackle itself from the tyranny of the Greens. Now, think about it this way. There are only two scenarios under which that this will be possible. One is for the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats to win enough votes between themselves that they can get at least 50% of the voting power in the Bundestag. Then they can go along without the Greens. Or the second, alternatively, you need the Free Democrats, okay, to cross the 5% threshold so that they can basically form a coalition government with the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats without the Greens. Okay. That was sort of like I wanted to be optimistic about Germany, about France, because I think the Germans, they haven't got very much, but they've got common sense. However, Elon Musk opened his big goddamn mouth and really, excuse my language, fucked it up for the Germans. Because Elon Musk, Elon Musk, as you probably know, 3 weeks ago decided to throw his support behind the AfD, which is the so-called extreme right-wing party in Germany. By the way, I've been a big supporter of AfD for the last 10 years. Okay, I definitely do not consider them to be an extreme party by any stretch of the imagination. But I think Elon Musk's timing is terrible. Even if, listen, the AfD is already going to be the second largest party in Germany after the election next month. By basically, throwing his support behind the AfD is now surging the polls. And guess what? They're taking votes away from the CDU and the SPD. Let me just tell you this. These parties in Germany have already swore that they're never going to go into a coalition government with the AfD, which I totally believe because Germany does have a historical baggage with respect to Nazism and so on and so forth. So the last country you're going to see the extreme right actually in the government is going to be Germany. But what this means is the rise of AfD because of Elon Musk means that the probability that the CDU and the SPD will end up having to bring in the Greens into the next government has gone up exponentially. So what I'm saying is that unless Elon Musk was intending to destroy Germany all along when he decided to throw his lot behind basically the AfD, maybe that's the chess move. I don't know. I don't think so. But Elon Musk is a clever guy, but he should basically keep his mouth shut, especially over subjects he's totally ignorant about. And it's very clear to me, when it comes to European politics, that guy doesn't know shit.
Very interesting points. And just as a reminder to our viewers, Germany's the third largest economy in the world. The European Union represents 20% of global GDP. So what happens in Germany and Europe has an impact on the entire global economy. I want to continue this discussion on geopolitics, and I want to get your views now on Greenland and also the Panama Canal. Trump has said he wants to buy Greenland, and he also wants to take over the Panama Canal. He also said recently he would not rule out military force to seize control of both. What are your thoughts on that, and do you think he would really do that?
I think, first of all, I think we have to basically I think, there's no doubt. I think there is something to the whole Greenland story, which I'm sympathetic to, by the way. Now, the reason why Trump wants a piece of Greenland is because, first of all, we've got this melting ice as a result of global warming. That's bringing up basically Arctic shipping lanes. And right now, the only countries that are actively trying to essentially, take a spot, are the Russians and China. So that's, so one thing Trump wants to do is not to be left behind in this race, against China and Russia. It doesn't mean that he wants to move ahead. He doesn't want to be left behind. The second thing, which is probably even more important, is the fact that the Russians have now developed the best submarines in the world. And by the best submarines in the world, we're talking about the quietest submarines in the world. The Russian nuclear submarines have gotten so quiet, they're beyond detection, by U.S. radar. I mean, as a result, right now, a Russian submarine can sail all the way up to New York and launch a nuclear missile on the city, and the Americans wouldn't even know until it actually happened. And this is the reason why the Defense Department is so, in favor of having some kind of intermediate stop, okay, between Russia and the U.S., like Greenland, where they can set up massive, basically, monitoring surveillance system, okay? I think there's a lot to do with that. And then the fact that Greenland, the population in Greenland, doesn't seem to care for their, Danish, landlord, and then they're quite sympathetic to have a closer relationship with the U.S. I think that just basically leaves the door wide open. It doesn't mean, Trump could, we'll see. I don't know. I don't think Trump will invade Greenland and basically take it by force. But I think there will be deals to be made, just like everything else. Okay, to the extent that maybe he could do something for the people in Greenland more. Okay, in exchange that they will give him a bigger base, or they might even consider themselves to be the 51st state. Whatever it is, this is not going to be by force or coercion. I guarantee you that. I think Panama Canal is a different story. I think the issue here is about leveling the playing field. It's not like Trump says, Panama Canal. He's basically saying, and I don't know if it's true or not, that U.S. companies are paying more for crossing the canal than, companies of other countries because, the ports, are operated by the Chinese on behalf of the Panamanians. By the way, it's not even strictly speaking Chinese. They're actually a Hong Kong company, Hutchinson. I don't even know to what extent. And this deal was basically made back in 1997 already, whatever it is. So we'll see about that, but I'm not that worried. I'm not that worried that Trump is going to send in troops into Panama and seize it basically by force. I think the Panamanians will have to basically, I suspect there's a deal to be made. And again, if you look at what's happening in so many other countries, this is the reason why I'm very bullish Mexico and very bearish Canada right now. Okay. In fact, I would buy the Mexican peso against the Canadian dollar because the Mexicans are so much more ahead of the Canadians in terms of trying to get a deal with Trump. My guess is that Trump has now set this deadline, February 1st, before he imposes this 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico. And my money is that that this is much more likely, the tariff is much more likely to hit Canada than in Mexico. And then we can talk about that if you're interested.
No, I'm based in Toronto, as you know, so I love talking about Canadian politics. And of course, the U.S. economy is very important to our economy. So why don't we talk about that? Tell me, especially being based in Israel, I'm curious what your views are and what your perspective is of Canada and what's happening here right now with our liberal government. So feel free, be frank.
Right. If you look at it, again, if you look at Canada versus Mexico, it's actually very interesting, right? Because you had Trudeau, who was a progressive, basically leader, who was supposed to improve the lot of the disadvantaged. And then you had AMLO, the outgoing president of Mexico, who actually brought about an improvement in the welfare of the poor. In fact, actually, if you look at, for example, income inequality, it narrowed under the presidency of AMLO. And it got worse under Trudeau. And one's a socialist, who's more successful. As a result of this, okay, AMLO's party, okay, and his successor, Claudia Sheinbaum, President Claudia Sheinbaum, won by a landslide in the election basically late last year. So they have a huge mandate, popular mandate from the Mexican people who wanted to thank AMLO for everything he did for Mexico and trust basically his party to do the right thing, okay? Obviously, I don't want to tell you, in the case of Trudeau, he basically did everything wrong. He ran the Canadian economy to the ground, okay? And as a result, he's now out. Even his party doesn't want him anymore. So right now, whereas in Mexico, you have a very stable government, basically with very strong popular backing, with the president enjoying very high approval rating. In Canada right now, you have a political vacuum, okay? We don't have a prime minister, and we don't have, not really a government. And then in any event, there's going to be an election no later than October this year, as you know. So in general, there's a lot of political certainty and stability in Mexico right now, and there's none of that, okay, in Canada. okay? And it's going to stay this way for the next 9 months. Now, just think about this, okay? But we don't have 9 months to wait because Trump wants results like right now, right? Because again, what he declared is he's giving Canada and Mexico until February 1st to do the right thing. Now, while the Canadians always haven't done a thing, okay, in the lame duck essentially session after the election, because they've been in basically the whole government's collapse and so on and so forth. The Mexicans have done everything. Let me just give you a sense of what the Mexicans have already done. I mean, in terms of preparing themselves, okay, for doing a deal with Trump. They, first of all, the 3 days after, okay, if you remember, Trudeau flew down to Mar-a-Lago after Claudia Sheinbaum actually did a phone call with Trump. It was after they had a phone call that Trudeau decided he didn't want to be left behind. He flew down to basically Mar-a-Lago, and obviously that whole trip was a total joke. Trump didn't take him seriously at all. But let me tell you what Claudia Sheinbaum has done in the last 6 weeks. 2 days after, okay, Claudia Sheinbaum had a call with Trump, Mexico seized 1 ton of fentanyl, okay, which is worth 200 million pesos, okay? The largest seizure on record anywhere in the world. That's number one. Number two, they have arrested 6,000 drug dealers over the last 6 weeks. Number three, they have completely revamped their customs system, okay? For example, they have completely banned the trading of counterfeit goods from China. I'm talking about these fake Gucci bags, Rolex watches that you find on Canal Street in New York that come from Mexico, but they're manufactured in China. The Mexicans have confiscated millions of dollars worth of these things, merchandise, over the last 4 weeks, okay? Moreover, the Mexicans have even gone so far as to say, they said this last week, by the way, in one of Sheinbaum's daily press conference, by the way, just talking about like politics being accountability. Claudia Sheinbaum does a press conference every morning, every single day. In other words, like she is having this conversation. It's like she's giving her report card every day to the Mexican people. And that tells you a lot about how the country operates. That's why I'm optimistic. Whereas Trudeau is like an idiot. Obviously, we all know that. Selfish idiot. And a real dumb guy, actually, with very low IQ also on top of that. Claudia Sheinbaum actually is a PhD. I mean, she's a professor, very, very smart guy. Women. But the point here is this. I couldn't even believe my ear last week when Claudia Sheinbaum actually said in one of her daily press conferences, she said, we are even willing to consider the possibility of taking in non-Mexican deportees, okay, from the U.S. When I heard that, I almost fell on the floor. I just couldn't even believe my ears, right? Because that is a stroke of genius, by the way. Because I've always said this, like for Trump to be successful with respect to his immigration policy, he'll have to be very, very nice to Mexico. Now, Trump just began, Trump's border czar yesterday just announced that they just started deportation already. Now, okay, so first of all, when you deport somebody, you got to deport somebody to somewhere. Where are you going to deport these people to? Depends on their country of origin, obviously. Do you know, over the last 4 years under Biden, only 20% of the people who entered the U.S. illegally came from Mexico. The rest of them came from all over, like Venezuela, Colombia, Panama, Guatemala, wherever they come from. Now, you think that these countries are going to say to Trump, don't worry, just send them back. We'll take them in. That would be a very, just think about that for a moment. Even if we're just talking about the criminal elements of them, especially the criminal elements of them, right? Because Trump is only deporting, right now he says they're only deporting the rapists, the drug dealers, the murderers, people with criminal records. They're trying to deport them. And you think that these countries are really going to want to take these people back, people that they miss so much? Probably not. So the fact that the Mexicans realize that this is where they've got some leverage, that they can, because if Mexico were to take in, let's just say, a Venezuelan who's been deported, all of a sudden that Venezuelan person is in Mexico. Does he want to stay in Mexico or go back to Venezuela? I suspect the choice is going to be pretty clear. He wants to go back to Venezuela. So from that point of view, like Mexico holds the gold, like they hold like a four aces in their basically hand right now. Like Trump cannot screw around with the Mexicans without really shooting themselves like big time in the foot. This is why I think the Mexicans, they've been proactive. They understand where they've got leverage. They understand what Trump wants, and they've been just like all over the stuff. Wow, really impressive. Very, very impressive. Because that's what international politics should be about. It's about understanding the other people's reaction functions, and then to be able to get an excellent bargain for it. I mean, there's no doubt Mexico is going to get a lot for being willing to take in deportees who are not Mexicans. I guarantee you that, by the way. Okay? I don't know the Mexicans already name a price, but I suspect Trump will pay a very high price for that privilege, being able to deport non-Mexicans into basically Mexico.
No, that will solve a lot of problems for him right away.
Yeah.
As long as they don't come to Canada, I'm okay with that.
Where's Canada? Canada's done nothing.
I know.
Nothing.
So I want to add a little bit of context just for our viewers, okay? So you were talking about the Canadian economy and how weak it's being. It is. The GDP has been in decline for many quarters now. If you look at GDP per capita in Canada, it's around 58,000 in USD versus the US, which is around 76,000. How we have that discrepancy and such a large discrepancy is beyond me. But anyhow, a lot of it has to do with the immigration problem that's been put forth by the Liberals and by Trudeau in the last 5+ years. And they're basically bringing in immigrants who aren't contributing to the economy. So it's causing disastrous results here. The other point I would just make about Trudeau and also our provincial leaders, it's just a state of chaos here. Nobody knows what the hell's going on. You mentioned we have a vacuum. We do. We don't have a real leader at the federal level because now we have a leadership race going on. He's going to be, I think the leadership race is coming up in the month of March. So effectively, we don't have a prime minister. And then even then, once we do get a new prime minister, there's going to be delays. And then we have the premier from Ontario who's trying to negotiate with the Americans. We have another premier from Alberta who's trying to negotiate with the Americans. So it's just total chaos right now.
It's total chaos. And also, as we all know, like, if you think about, I think, I suspect when Freeland resigned, okay, after Trudeau's, trip to Mar-a-Lago, was because she was in favor, or at least there's a faction of the Liberal Party that's in favor of sticking it to the Americans, right? Because Freeland, if you remember, she was very tough, actually, during Trump's first term. In fact, she was so tough, that was the reason why the renegotiation of USMCA took much longer than it was thought possible, because, the Mexicans were willing to do a deal. A lot of people thought the Mexicans were going to be the difficult ones. It turned out it was the Canadians, and it had a lot to do with Freeland. So now,
and that's I'm sorry to interject, David, but that's the messaging she's pitching right now in her campaign or leadership race.
Exactly. So she's going to say, if Mark Carney says anything else, Freeland's going to say, well, it's selling out to the Americans. Like, well, you want to be the 51st, you want to be basically the 51st state, and so on and so forth. Right now, I think, obviously, we all know the Canadians don't want to become the 51st state. So when she's campaigning on getting tough with someone, President Trump, who is threatening to basically turn Canada into a 51st state, it's a very easy political message to sell. It's going to help her. Okay. This is why I think the political dynamic is such right now that, literally nobody is going to say, well, let's try to basically work something out with the Americans. That's, even though I don't even think it's that difficult to work something out. Because under Trudeau, for example, as you know, fentanyl, the government of Canada, the provincial governments of Canada have been handing out fentanyl, okay, to addicts, because they say, well, we'd rather give them the stuff rather than have them go out and rob and steal in order to basically get hold of the stuff. And of course, the stuff ends up basically coming to the US. But it's actually very interesting because I think a lot of people don't understand what Trump meant when he said, oh, well, Canada wants to become the 51st state. The reason is very simple. Because right now, right, Canada let in all these 3 million people in the last 3 years. I mean, and by the way, it's a total departure from the immigration policy of Canada in the past, which was to only allow in skilled labor, okay? And now they basically, Trudeau decided to open the door to everybody. So all these people, they arrive in Canada, they can't find work, so they all want to go to the U.S. Now, that's why they become a problem. Now, moreover, the problem is that the border between the U.S. and Canada is barely supervised, right? Right now, while Trudeau complains about the fact that he hasn't got enough money to basically invest in, security, basically people, like immigration people, to check everybody's got a visa or whatever before they go into the U.S. This is why Trump is saying, you kidding me? Right now, there's no patrolling between New York and Connecticut. You can drive directly from New York to Connecticut because it's partisan. If Canada does not want to basically check people from going in and out, make sure they're illegal, you might as well become the 51st state of the U.S. because you are behaving like one. And that's what Trump really is trying to basically get at. And this is not about Canada being some second class, whatever country, we're going to take you over. It's about the fact that Canada has failed to take basically responsibility as a country, okay? Because a responsible country actually will look after its border to make sure that, the illegal people don't enter from their country into basically its neighbor. And if you're that's what Trump's after. So from that point of view, I think Trump has a very reasonable ask. I think the fact that Canada is just doing nothing right now, it's unfortunate, but I think unfortunately, I just don't see anything being worked out between now and February 1st. That's why for your viewer, you should consider selling the Canadian dollar and buying the Mexican peso. I think as basically a 10-day trade, I think that's going to be a pretty decent trade.
The only other point I would make about what you just said is that in terms of drugs or illegal immigrants or guns or anything going into the U.S., that's the responsibility of the U.S. Border Patrol, not Canada's.
Yeah, I don't know. Listen, to be honest, I don't really know. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know the facts that well. I think from that point of view, I know the Canadians are saying that, the Americans saying completely opposite. So we'll leave that alone for now. But again, it's about negotiation at the end of the day. Right now, I think we both agree there is no negotiation going on. So Trudeau, before he stepped in, he basically allocated a bit more money, I think of 50 million Canadian dollars that was going to beef up the immigration department so that they could have more men on the ground. Okay. But as though that's going to do anything. But that's what we're talking about here.
No, you're right. That was something else that just came about here in the last month. They said they were going to strengthen their security at the border, and they were going to put more troops on the ground. They were going to have helicopters, drones, etc. And I was just thinking to myself, why the hell weren't you doing that 5 years ago? I just assumed that was already being done, but it's like they just woke up and said, "Oh my God, we got a problem here. Let's put this into action now." Okay, you mentioned Mark Carney a couple of times, and for those people who might not know, he was the former the governor of Bank of Canada and also the governor of the Bank of England. What are your thoughts on Carney?
I think Carney will be a good guy. I think, obviously, he's a market-friendly guy. I mean, I think, and he's also someone who has an international, recognition, which I think is important. But I think the problem, but Mark Carney is a central banker. He's not a politician, okay? And, central banking at the end of the day, it's a relatively straightforward thing. Listen, I do have a PhD in economics. I was the #1 ranked, basically, macro strategist on Wall Street. So when I say relatively straightforward, I really mean it. I mean, I don't mean it, sure, you could be, just think about this. The Fed has no idea whether to hike rates, lower rates. What? Honestly, central banks is sort of in person, you close. People think, oh, wow, these people really know a lot about whatever it is. In the end, for them, what they call data dependency is we don't know. So what I'm telling you is that Mark Carney, the fact that he was, the central bank governor of Canada, central bank governor of the UK, I don't think it says very much in terms of his actually the qualification to become the next prime minister of Canada. So I think from that point of view, I think the jury's still out. I mean, I'm obviously, I'm rooting for the Conservative. I think the guy's good. And at least based on the little I know about him, reading about him and so on and so forth. But that's a story for later. But I do think that it feels to me that Carney stands a pretty good chance right now. Okay, at least basically winning the leadership battle, the liberals. But I think you're going to find him on one hand this, on the other hand, that kind of guy. And right now, what is very clear, that kind of guy, basically, it's got no game. Okay, that kind of guy is not going to basically win the election for sure later this year.
And the view is Carney is just an extension of Trudeau. That's the view in Canada. So he may become the leader of the Liberal Party and he might become the next Prime Minister of Canada, but he won't be in the next election. And it's interesting what you were saying earlier about the changes we saw in Italy since we got a new government there. You didn't mention Argentina, but we've seen amazing changes there in terms of the economy and the progress they're making in terms of their fiscal policies, et cetera. And that's also because of a government that's right of center. And we're going to have one here in Canada before the year is out. And it's going to be interesting to see what positive changes are coming. The only thing is the damage that's been done here just in the last 5 years, never mind the last 10, it's going to take a very long time to turn it around.
I agree. I mean, I want to buy Canada, but I think the election is still too far away. You cannot trade 9 months ahead, that kind of thing. So I think, I'm happy to stay on the sideline right now.
Well, David, that was a great discussion, and I love talking geopolitics with you, especially when it comes to Canada. But if somebody would like to learn more about you and follow you online, where can they go?
You can check out my website, davidwuunbound.com, where I offer, that's my retail side. I've got a big institutional business, which is relevant for most of you guys, but my retail business, it's $100 a year is nothing. I mean, or if you haven't even got $100 a year, you can follow me on my YouTube channel, actually. I've got a YouTube channel, David Unbound. It's unbound. I mean, I call it unbound because I'm unbound from Wall Street. Spent 20 years on Wall Street. I spent too much time, especially towards the end of my career, with legal and compliance. I said, you know what? It's time for me to break out, to basically do my own thing so that I can speak my mind as I see them.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I also worked on the sell side for many years, and the compliance is stifling. So anyhow, once again, I'm a subscriber to your channel. I would highly recommend our viewers check it out. David, I want to thank you very much for making the time today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that discussion with David, where we touched on so many geopolitical situations that are happening throughout the world right now. And as David mentioned, there's a lot going on throughout the world. And if you need help making sense of it all and how it will impact your financial future, consider having a discussion with a professional financial advisor. You can find out more information at wealthion.com/free. Once again, that's wealthion.com/free. And if you have any suggestions on who else you would like to see on the Wealthion channel, let us know in the comment section below. Thank you very much for being with us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.